March 15, 1992. Attica Correctional Facility. Guard Marcus Williams had 30 seconds to unlock cell block D before the lights came back on. Vincent Torino slipped him the envelope. $100,000 in cash. Williams turned the key. What happened in Mike Tyson's cell that night stayed buried for 30 years. The warden called it a plumbing incident. The media never heard about it. Even Torino's own crew thought he just disappeared. But 3 decades later, when fishermen pulled Torino's body from the Hudson River, everything changed. Prison number 922,335 was carved deep into his forehead. Tyson's old number, a message 15 years in the making. The families Torino had destroyed started asking questions, and Marcus Williams realized that some debts never get forgiven, they just get transferred. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weight of silence. Marcus "Tank" Williams wiped the grease from his hands with the same methodical precision he'd once used to count inmates during headcount. The rag came away black, but his fingers still felt dirty. They'd felt that way for 30 years. The auto shop bell chimed as another customer pushed through the glass door. Tank didn't look up from the Chevy's engine block. Catskill was small enough that he knew most folks by their footsteps, and these boots moved with purpose, heavy, deliberate, the kind that belonged to men who'd learned to walk quietly when they needed to. "We're closing in 10 minutes, Tank called out, his voice carrying the authority that 15 years as Attica's head warden had beaten into him. The footsteps stopped just behind his shoulder. Marcus Williams? Tank's wrench slipped, knuckles scraping against metal. That voice carried an accent he hadn't heard in decades. South Brooklyn. The kind that came from neighborhoods where children learned to whisper and adults settled scores with handshakes and shallow graves. He turned slowly. 3 men stood in his shop, their expensive suits looking as out of place among the motor oil and spare parts as silk ties at a funeral. The one in front, maybe 45, with silver threading through his dark hair, held a photograph between 2 fingers. "Vincent Torino," the man said, letting the picture flutter to the concrete floor. "Know him?" Tank's mouth went dry. In the photo, Torino looked exactly as he had that night in 1992. Sharp-featured, cold eyes, the kind of smile that promised violence. But Tank had seen Torino's real face on the news 3 weeks ago when they'd pulled him from the Hudson. What the river hadn't claimed, something else had destroyed. The prison number carved into his forehead had been the cleanest part left. "Should I?" Tank asked, though his voice betrayed nothing. 30 years of keeping secrets had taught him to lie without flinching. The man stepped closer. "My name is Anthony Torino. Vincent was my cousin. Family's been asking questions about his extended vacation. Seems like he took a trip to Attica back in '92. Paid someone a lot of money for a guided tour." Tank's hand moved instinctively toward the tire iron hanging on the pegboard, but stopped. These weren't the kind of men you fought. These were the kind you ran from if you were smart, if you were lucky. "I worked at Attica," Tank said carefully. "Lots of people came through those doors. Not as visitors." Anthony pulled out a manila envelope, thick as a phone book. "My cousin was thorough, kept records, names, dates, amounts. Funny thing about Vincent, he never trusted anyone completely. Good thing, too, since someone murdered him." The envelope hit the workbench with a dull thud. Tank could see papers spilling out, photocopied documents, bank records, what looked like surveillance photos. His own face stared back at him from a grainy black-and-white image, 30 years younger but unmistakably him. $100,000, Anthony continued conversationally. "That's what Vincent paid for 30 minutes alone with Mike Tyson. Family's been wondering what happened during those 30 minutes, why Vincent never came home, why no one heard from him until some fisherman hooked him last month." Tank forced himself to breathe normally. "Maybe you should ask Tyson." Anthony laughed, but the sound held no humor. "Tried that. Man's got a funny relationship with the truth these days. Says he doesn't remember much from prison. Convenient memory loss. But here's what I find interesting. Vincent's body shows up with Tyson's old prison number carved into his skull, and suddenly everyone who was at Attica that night develops amnesia. One of the other men stepped forward, younger, hungrier. His hand moved inside his jacket with practiced ease. Maybe we should help him remember, Anthony. Patience, Tommy. Anthony never took his eyes off Tank. See, Mr. Williams, my cousin destroyed a lot of families before he disappeared. Owed money to people who don't forget debts. Those people have been waiting 30 years for closure. Now they're asking me to provide it. Tank's shop suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in like a cell. Through the window he could see his truck in the parking lot, keys in his pocket, freedom 20 feet away. But he'd learned enough about men like Anthony to know that running only delayed the inevitable. What do you want? Tank asked. Truth. What happened in that cell? Why did Vincent pay you all that money just to end up dead? And most importantly, Anthony leaned closer, his breath smelling of expensive coffee and old cigarettes. Who really killed my cousin? The shop fell silent except for the tick of cooling metal and the distant hum of traffic on Route 23. Tank looked down at his hands, still stained with grease and 30 years of regret. In that moment, he realized that some secrets were too heavy to carry alone, and some debts could only be paid in blood. But what these men didn't understand, what nobody understood, was that Mike Tyson's silence wasn't about guilt. It was about protection. Introduction. Tank's calloused fingers traced the edge of the workbench, feeling every gouge and oil stain like a roadmap of the quiet life he'd built after Attica. The manila envelope sat before him like a loaded gun, its contents spilling across the metal surface. Bank statements, photographs, receipts that documented his fall from grace with the precision of an autopsy report. I need to close up, Tank said finally, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. My granddaughter's coming for dinner. Anthony Torino's smile was razor thin. Family man, I respect that. He gestured to his companions, and they stepped back with the fluid coordination of predators who'd hunted together before. We'll be in touch, Mr. Williams. Soon. The three men filed out as quietly as they'd entered, leaving only the lingering scent of expensive cologne and implied violence. Tank waited until their black sedan disappeared down Route 23 before his legs finally gave out. He sank onto a milk crate beside the Chevy, head in his hands, feeling every one of his 58 years like stones in his chest. The shop around him, Williams Auto Repair, painted in fading blue letters on the window, had been his sanctuary for 2 decades. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across shelves lined with spark plugs and air filters, the mundane inventory of an honest man's honest work. The smell of motor oil and metal shavings had replaced the stench of disinfectant and desperation that had clung to his uniform at Attica. Here, problems had solutions. Broken things could be fixed, but some breaks went too deep for repair. Tank's phone buzzed against his hip. The caller ID made him smile despite everything. Emma, my favorite granddaughter. She was his only granddaughter, but the joke had stuck since she turned 7. Grandpa? Emma's voice carried the particular brand of excitement that only a 9-year-old could manufacture. Mom says I can sleep over tonight if it's okay with you. Can we work on the Mustang? Tank looked across the shop to where a 1967 Fastback sat under a tarp, his weekend project that had stretched into years. Emma loved sitting in the driver's seat, hands on the steering wheel, making engine noises while he explained how carburetors worked. In those moments, with her gap-toothed grin and her mother's dark eyes, Tank could almost forget the weight he carried. Course you can, sweetheart. I'll pick up pizza on the way home. Extra cheese? Is there any other kind? After she hung up, Tank sat in the growing darkness of his shop, surrounded by the tools and parts that had given him purpose after his world collapsed. The job at Attica had been everything to him once. The authority, the respect, the steady paycheck that had bought a house in Albany and put his daughter Sarah through nursing school. Warden Williams, they'd called him, a man who mattered. Now he was just Tank, the mechanic who could make your truck run another 50,000 miles and who never talked about where he'd worked before. Sarah knew, of course. She'd been 22 when the scandal broke, when Internal Affairs started asking questions about missing paperwork and unexplained gaps in security footage from that night in '92. Tank had resigned before they could fire him, taking his pension and his shame to this small town where nobody cared about your past as long as you showed up on time and charged fair prices. His daughter had forgiven him eventually, or at least stopped asking questions. But she'd never let him forget that Emma was the most precious thing in either of their lives. "She's not just your second chance, Dad," Sarah had told him once. "She's mine, too." Tank began gathering the scattered documents from the envelope, his hands moving automatically while his mind raced. Anthony Torino's visit changed everything. The family wouldn't just disappear. Men like that didn't make threats they weren't prepared to keep. And if they were willing to corner him in his own shop, they'd have no qualms about following him home. Home, where Emma would be waiting with her homework spread across the kitchen table, where she'd want to hear about his day and share stories from 4th grade. Home, where the back porch light stayed on because she was afraid of the dark, and where Tank had spent countless evenings teaching her to throw a curveball in the backyard. The weight of 30 years pressed down on his shoulders as he locked up the shop. In the parking lot, his reflection stared back from the truck's window, gray-haired, thick around the middle, wearing the same Carhartt jacket he'd owned for a decade. He looked like exactly what he was, a small-town mechanic getting ready to pick up pizza for his granddaughter. But Anthony Torino had seen something else in those surveillance photos. He'd seen the man who'd taken blood money and opened doors that should have stayed locked forever. As Tank drove toward Emma's favorite pizza place, he couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully constructed quiet life was about to shatter. And when it did, the pieces would cut deeper than just him. They'd cut the only person who still believed Marcus Tank Williams was worth loving. Inciting incident. Tank pulled into Tony's Pizza, the neon sign flickering against the growing dusk like a dying heartbeat. Through the plate glass window, he could see the familiar chaos of Friday night. Families crowded into red vinyl booths, teenagers clustered around the arcade games, the comfortable noise of a small town unwinding after a long week. Normal people living normal lives, untouched by the kind of darkness that had followed him home from Brooklyn accents and manila envelopes. His phone rang as he reached for the door handle. The number on the display made his blood freeze. He'd memorized those digits 30 years ago, had dialed them from his office at Attica more times than he could count. The area code was upstate, but the exchange was pure trouble, the kind that came from men who collected debts in hospital rooms and shallow graves. Tank almost didn't answer, almost let it ring through to voicemail and pretended he'd never seen Anthony Torino's surveillance photos. But some calls couldn't be avoided forever. Williams. "Hello, Marcus." The voice was older now, rougher but unmistakable. Vincent the Ghost Torino spoke like a man calling from beyond the grave, which, according to the Hudson River fisherman, was exactly where he'd been for 30 years. Surprised, Tank's truck keys slipped from his fingers, clattering to the asphalt. Around him, Catskill continued its Friday evening routine. Couples walking hand in hand, teenagers on skateboards, the pizza shop's door chiming as customers came and went. But for Tank, the world had narrowed to the voice in his phone and the impossible reality that dead men could still dial numbers. "You're supposed to be dead," Tank whispered. Vincent's laugh was like sandpaper on bone. "Funny thing about death, sometimes it's negotiable. You should know. You arranged my first meeting with it." Tank leaned against his truck, legs suddenly unsteady. Through the pizza shop window, he could see Tony Marcelli behind the counter, tossing dough with the same practiced ease he'd shown for 20 years. Normal, safe. Everything Tank's life had been until 3 hours ago. The body in the Hudson had my ID, my dental records, even my dear cousin Anthony convinced it was me. Vincent's voice carried a satisfaction that made Tank's skin crawl. "Took me 3 decades to arrange that little performance. Amazing what you can accomplish when everyone thinks you're dead." Tank's mind raced through the implications. If Vincent was alive, then Anthony Torino's visit wasn't about revenge for a dead cousin. It was about something worse, something that required 30 years of planning and the kind of patience that only came from pure hatred. "What do you want?" Tank asked. "Same thing I wanted in 1992. Same thing I paid you $100,000 for. Access." Vincent paused, and Tank could hear traffic in the background, the sound of a city that never slept. "See, Marcus, our business was never finished. That night in Tyson's cell, let's just say the Iron Mike and I reached an understanding. A very specific understanding about what would happen if certain information ever became public." Tank's free hand clenched into a fist. He remembered that night with crystal clarity. the weight of the cash in his desk drawer, Vincent's cold confidence as Tank led him through the corridors of Attica, the sound of the cell door sliding shut. What happened next had haunted Tank's sleep for 3 decades. "Tyson killed you," Tank said. "I saw the aftermath. The blood. You saw what I wanted you to see." Vincent's voice turned sharp. "Mike Tyson never laid a hand on me. What he did was worse. He made me a promise. Told me that if I ever showed my face again, if I ever tried to collect on what he owed me, he'd make sure the families I'd wronged would know exactly where to find me." Through the pizza shop window, Tank watched a father lift his young daughter onto a stool at the counter. She couldn't have been much older than Emma, her pigtails bouncing as she pointed excitedly at the menu. Innocent, protected, everything Tank had worked 30 years to preserve. "The prison number carved into the body," Tank said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn like a sick sunrise. "That wasn't Tyson's calling card. That was yours." "Very good, Marcus." I knew that Warden's brain was still working somewhere under all that small-town grease. Vincent's approval felt like poison in Tank's ears. The number was a message, to Tyson, to you, to anyone else who thought Vincent Torino was finished. Tank closed his eyes, feeling the last 30 years of careful peace crumbling around him. "You're coming back." "I'm already here." Vincent's voice dropped to a whisper that carried more menace than any shout. "And Marcus, this time I'm not paying for access. This time, you're going to help me, because if you don't, that pretty little granddaughter of yours is going to learn some very ugly truths about the man who taught her to throw a curveball." The line went dead. Tank stood frozen in Tony's pizza parking lot, phone still pressed to his ear, watching normal families live normal lives through window glass that might as well have been a prison wall. Vincent Torino was alive, and Tank's carefully constructed world had just become a target. Early development. Tank's hands shook as he pocketed the phone, the device feeling like it weighed 50 pounds. Around him, Catskill's Friday evening continued its peaceful rhythm, car doors slamming, children's laughter echoing from the playground across the street, the warm glow of Tony's pizza promising comfort he could no longer claim. He stood rooted in the parking lot, a 60-year-old man suddenly feeling ancient and fragile. Get the pizza. Go home. Act normal. The mantra repeated in his head as he forced his legs to move. Inside Tony's, the familiar chaos felt surreal. Steam rising from fresh pies, the teenage cashier counting bills with practiced boredom, families arguing over toppings. Tank approached the counter like a sleepwalker. "Hey, Tank." Tony Marcelli waved from behind the ovens, his face flushed from heat and honest work. "Emma's usual?" Tank nodded, not trusting his voice. Tony had known Emma since she was 5, always saved her an extra breadstick, asked about her Little League games. Good people, clean people, people who didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire of decisions made 3 decades ago. "You okay, buddy?" Tony appeared at the register, concern creasing his weathered features. "You look like you seen a ghost." "Close enough." Tank managed a weak smile. "Just tired. Long day." But Tony's expression didn't change. In a town this size, people knew each other's rhythms, could spot trouble from 3 blocks away. Tank realized he was gripping the counter hard enough to leave fingerprints in the formica. "Medium pizza, extra cheese," Tony said slowly. "On the house tonight." "Tony, you don't need to." "I said on the house." Tony's voice carried the kind of finality that came from 20 years of feeding neighbors during hard times. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Tank, if you're in some kind of trouble, my brother-in-law's still with the state police. Good man, discreet." Tank's throat tightened. In 30 years, Tony had never asked about Tank's past, never pushed when Tank deflected questions about his previous work. But now, seeing whatever Vincent's call had done to his face, Tony was offering help without even knowing what kind of darkness might follow. "Thanks, but it's nothing I can't handle," Tank lied. Tony studied him for another moment, then nodded and returned to the ovens. But Tank caught him glancing back twice, and when the pizza was ready, Tony walked it out personally instead of calling Tank's number. "Tell Emma I said hi," Tony said, handing over the box. "And Tank? That offer stands, anytime." The drive home took Tank through Catskill's quiet neighborhoods, modest houses with front porches and swing sets, American flags hanging limp in the evening air, the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked and knew their mailman's name. Tank had chosen this town specifically for its distance from everything he'd left behind, but now that distance felt as thin as tissue paper. He pulled into his driveway as Emma burst through the front door, backpack bouncing against her shoulders, gap-toothed grin splitting her face. 9 years old and fearless, she had Sarah's dark hair and quick mind, but her eyes belonged to Tank. Steady, curious, unafraid to look directly at whatever life threw her way. "Grandpa!" She launched herself at him before he was fully out of the truck, arms wrapping around his waist with the complete trust that only children could manage. "Mom said I could stay until Sunday if you want. We could finish the brake job on the Mustang." Tank hugged her tight, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and playground dirt. For a moment, Vincent's voice faded, replaced by the solid reality of Emma's warmth against his chest. This was what mattered. This was what he'd spent 30 years protecting. "Course you can stay, sweetheart, but dinner first." Inside, Emma spread her homework across the kitchen table, while Tank busied himself with plates and napkins, desperate for routine to hold back the chaos in his head. Emma chattered about her social studies project, something about local history, while Tank tried to focus on her words instead of Vincent's threats. "Mrs. Patterson says lots of famous people lived around here," Emma said, pulling cheese off her pizza slice. "Like that boxer who went to prison, Mike something. She says there's all kinds of stories about what really happened back then." Tank's hands went still. "What kind of stories?" "Oh, you know, prison stuff. Guards who got in trouble. Money changing hands." Emma shrugged with the casual indifference of a child discussing ancient history. Boring grown-up stuff. "But Mrs. Patterson says sometimes the truth is different than what people remember." Tank stared at his granddaughter, this innocent child casually discussing the exact events that were now threatening to destroy everything he'd built. The irony felt like a knife between his ribs. Emma was researching his greatest shame for a school project, and she had no idea the man who'd betrayed his oath and sold his integrity was sitting across from her, cutting her pizza into smaller pieces. His phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number. "Nice house, peaceful neighborhood, perfect for raising children." Through the kitchen window, Tank saw a dark sedan parked across the street, engine running. Tank's blood turned to ice water. He set down his knife with deliberate calm, but his eyes never left the sedan's tinted windows. "Emma, sweetheart, could you grab us some napkins from the pantry?" She rolled her eyes but slid off her chair, disappearing into the narrow pantry that connected to the kitchen. The moment she was out of sight, Tank moved to the window, angling himself so he could see the street without being visible from outside. The sedan sat directly across from his house, positioned for a clear view of the front door and driveway. No license plate visible from this angle. Engine exhaust whispered against the evening air like a threat. Emma returned with a handful of napkins. "Grandpa, you're being weird. Why are you hiding by the window?" "Just checking the weather," Tank lied, forcing himself back to the table. But he chose the chair that kept the window in his peripheral vision. "Tell me more about this history project." Emma brightened, launching into details about interviews and research, while Tank's mind raced through possibilities. Vincent wouldn't show himself, not yet, but he'd want Tank to know he was being watched, want him to understand that nowhere was safe. The message was clear: "I can reach you anywhere. I can reach her anywhere." "And Mrs. Patterson says some of the old guards still live around here," Emma continued, oblivious to the way Tank's jaw had clenched. "She thinks they might have stories about what really happened. You know, the stuff that didn't make the newspapers." Tank's phone buzzed again. Another text, beautiful child. Her mother's eyes, I think. "Does she know Grandpa used to let bad men into places they shouldn't be?" The napkin in Tank's hand tore. Emma looked up from her pizza, concern flickering across her face. "Grandpa, you look sick." "Just tired," Tank managed, but his voice sounded wrong even to him. He cleared his throat, tried again. "Why don't you work on your homework? I'll clean up." As Emma spread textbooks across the table, Tank carried dishes to the sink with movements that felt mechanical, rehearsed. Through the window above the faucet, he watched the sedan. Whoever was inside had a perfect view of this domestic scene. Grandfather and granddaughter, homework and leftover pizza, the kind of peaceful evening that Vincent had never known and therefore couldn't understand the value of destroying, but he understood leverage. "Grandpa?" Emma's voice carried a note Tank had never heard before. Uncertainty. "That car's been out there since I got here. The same guy's been sitting in it the whole time." Tank's hands stilled on the dishwater. "What guy?" "I saw him when Mom dropped me off. Big guy in a dark coat. He was smoking, but now he's just sitting there." Emma had inherited Tank's observation skills along with his eyes. "Is he watching our house?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Tank could lie, deflect, tell her it was probably just someone waiting for directions. But Emma was too smart, and the fear in her voice told him she already knew something was wrong. "Stay away from the windows," Tank said quietly. Emma's face went pale. "Grandpa, what's happening?" Before Tank could answer, his phone rang. Not a text this time, a call from the same number Vincent had used at Tony's. Tank stared at the display, knowing that answering would cross a line, would acknowledge Vincent's power in front of Emma. But not answering might be worse. "Go to your room," Tank told Emma. "Now." "But Grandpa." "Now." The sharpness in his voice made her flinch, and Tank immediately hated himself for it. But she obeyed, gathering her books with quick, frightened movements. Tank waited until he heard her bedroom door close before answering. "What do you want?" he whispered. "I want you to remember, Marcus." Vincent's voice was soft, almost gentle. "I want you to remember what it felt like when your whole world could disappear with one phone call, when everything you'd built could be taken away because of choices you made in the dark." Through the window, Tank saw the sedan's door open. A figure emerged, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the careful precision of a man accustomed to violence. He didn't approach the house, just stood beside the car, making sure Tank could see him clearly. "I remember," Tank said. "Good. Because that's what's going to happen to little Emma's world if you don't give me what I need." Vincent paused, and Tank could hear him breathing. 30 years ago, you took my money and opened a door. Now I need another door opened." "Same job, Marcus, same skills, just a different lock." The figure by the car lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating a face Tank didn't recognize, but whose presence he understood perfectly. "And if I refuse?" Then Emma learned some very interesting things about her grandfather. "And so does everyone else in your perfect little town." The line went dead. Outside, the figure dropped his cigarette, crushed it under his heel, and got back into the sedan. But the car didn't leave. Tank stood at his kitchen window, phone dead in his hand, watching the sedan's taillights burn like red eyes in the darkness. The figure was back inside, but the message had been delivered with military precision. Vincent knew exactly where Tank lived, exactly what mattered to him, exactly how to apply pressure until something broke. But as Tank stared at those glowing taillights, a memory surfaced, one that had been buried under 30 years of guilt and careful forgetting. The night in Tyson's cell hadn't ended the way he remembered, or rather, it had ended exactly that way. But Tank had never understood what he was really seeing. The blood on the walls, Vincent's screams echoing through D-Block, and afterward, when Tank had finally worked up the courage to check the cell, he'd found Vincent crumpled in the corner, alive but changed, broken in ways that had nothing to do with physical violence. "He didn't touch me," Vincent had whispered, his voice hollow with something worse than pain. "He just talked, made me understand things." Tank had assumed it was shock, the kind of psychological trauma that came from facing Iron Mike Tyson in an 8x10 box with nowhere to run. But now, with 3 decades of distance, other details crystallized. The way Tyson had looked at Tank afterward, not with anger, but with something that might have been disappointment. The careful way he'd spoken about choices and consequences. The almost gentle tone when he'd said, "That man won't be bothering anyone for a while, Warden Williams." Tank's breath fogged the window as understanding hit him like a physical blow. Tyson hadn't been the victim that night. He'd been the protector. The phone buzzed with another message. "Tomorrow, 2 p.m. The old quarry on Route 9W. Come alone, and we finish what we started 30 years ago." Tank deleted the message and immediately dialed a number he hadn't called in 15 years. It rang 4 times before a familiar voice answered, deeper now, weathered by time and experience, but unmistakable. "Mike?" Tank's voice cracked on the name. A long pause. Traffic sounds in the background, the distant rumble of city life. When Tyson finally spoke, his words carried the weight of 3 decades. "Marcus Williams. I wondered when you'd call. You knew Vincent was alive." "I knew Vincent was broken." Tyson's voice was calm, matter-of-fact. "What I told him in that cell, it wasn't a threat, Marcus. It was a choice. He could disappear and live with what he'd learned about himself, or he could keep being the man who hurt people and face the consequences." Tank closed his eyes, finally understanding the true cost of that $100,000. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. About his daughter." The words hit Tank like a sledgehammer. In all his research on Vincent Torino, in all the files and background checks that should have been done before taking that money, there had never been any mention of family. Vincent was a ghost, a man without connections or vulnerabilities. That was what had made him valuable. "He doesn't have a daughter," Tank whispered. "He did." Tyson's voice carried the patience of someone who had learned hard truths about the world. "Little girl named Sophia. 8 years old when Vincent started working for the Castellano family. She was living with her grandmother in Brooklyn while Vincent traveled for business." Tank's free hand gripped the windowsill. "Was?" "Car accident. Drunk driver ran a red light while Vincent was in Detroit, breaking someone's legs for 30 pieces of silver." Tyson paused, and Tank could hear him breathing. "She died calling for her daddy. Spent her last words asking why he never came to see her anymore." The kitchen tilted around Tank. 30 years of guilt, 30 years of carrying the weight of betraying a good man to a killer. And the killer had been carrying his own weight the entire time. Vincent hadn't been some untouchable professional. He'd been a father who chose money over presence, violence over love, and lost everything that mattered because of it. "That night in the cell," Tank said slowly, "you told him about Sophia." "I told him about choice," Tyson corrected, "about what happens when you pick the wrong thing often enough. Vincent thought he was coming to hurt me, but he was really coming to face what he'd become. Some men break from fists, Marcus. Others break from truth." Outside, the sedan's engine coughed to life. Tank watched it pull away from the curb, taillights disappearing around the corner like retreating demons. But Vincent's absence felt more ominous than his presence. "He's back," Tank said, "and he wants something from me." Tyson was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried the iron that had made him a legend. "Maybe it's time Vincent learned that some truths don't change, no matter how long you run from them." The line went dead, leaving Tank alone in his kitchen with the terrible understanding that everything he'd believed about that night had been wrong. And Vincent Torino wasn't the monster in this story. He was just another broken man who'd forgotten how to be human. Tank stood motionless in his dark kitchen, Tyson's words echoing in the silence like aftershocks from an earthquake. The phone felt impossibly heavy in his hand as the full weight of 30 years of misunderstanding crashed down on him. He'd spent 3 decades carrying guilt for betraying a good man to a killer, when the truth was far more complicated and far more tragic. Through the window, the street lay empty under yellow street lights, but Tank could still feel Vincent's presence like a cold draft. The man who'd emerged from that sedan wasn't the same professional killer who'd walked into D Block 30 years ago. That man had died in Tyson's cell, killed not by violence, but by the terrible clarity of understanding what his choices had cost him. What walked among the living now was something worse, a hollow shell animated by decades of running from a truth too painful to face. Sophia. 8 years old and calling for a daddy who chose blood money over bedtime stories. The image hit Tank like a physical blow, and he had to grip the counter to keep from falling. Emma's door creaked open down the hall. "Grandpa?" Her voice was small, frightened. "Who were you talking to?" Tank composed himself with an effort that felt like lifting concrete. "Just work stuff, sweetheart. Go back to bed." "I can't sleep. That car scared me." Footsteps padded across hardwood, and then Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, clutching her stuffed elephant like armor against the dark. "Are we in trouble?" The question sliced through Tank's chest. "Are we in trouble?" How could he explain that trouble was something he'd purchased with blood money 30 years ago, and now the bill had finally come due? How could he tell this innocent child that her grandfather's shame was about to tear apart the only family she'd ever known? "Come here," he said instead, opening his arms. Emma ran to him, burying her face against his chest, while Tank held her tight enough to feel her heartbeat against his ribs. She smelled like strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence, everything pure and good in his world, everything Vincent's return threatened to destroy. "I need to tell you something," Tank said carefully. "I might have to go away for a little while." Emma pulled back, eyes wide with alarm. "What do you mean, like a trip?" "Maybe. I don't know yet." Tank smoothed her hair, memorizing the feel of it between his fingers. "But if I do, I want you to remember that I love you more than anything in this world. And whatever happens, whatever anyone tells you about me, that will never change. Grandpa, you're scaring me." "Good," Tank thought. "You should be scared." But he forced his voice to stay steady, calm. "I just need you to understand that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, big mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes come back to haunt us." Emma studied his face with the unsettling perception children possessed when adults tried to hide important truths. "What kind of mistake?" Tank closed his eyes, seeing Vincent's hollow stare in that prison cell, hearing Tyson's voice explaining choices and consequences. "The kind where you choose money over doing what's right, where you let fear make decisions instead of courage. Is that why the scary man was watching our house?" The casual way she said it, the scary man, made Tank's blood run cold. Emma had inherited his observational skills, which meant she'd seen more than he'd hoped. She knew something was hunting them, even if she didn't understand what or why. "Yes," he admitted. "That's exactly why." Emma considered this with the serious expression she wore when working through complex math problems. "Are you going to fight him?" Tank almost smiled at the question. His granddaughter, 9 years old and barely 4 feet tall, asking if her grandfather was going to fight the monster that had emerged from his past. The faith in her voice, not doubt, just curiosity about tactics, reminded him why this mattered. Why some battles had to be fought, regardless of the cost. "I'm going to try to fix things," Tank said. "But first, I need to make some calls." As Emma reluctantly returned to her room, Tank pulled out his phone and scrolled through contacts he hadn't used in years. People from his old life. Men who understood violence and consequences and the price of keeping secrets. If Vincent wanted to finish what started 30 years ago, Tank wouldn't face him alone. The first call went to Jimmy Rodriguez, who'd been his deputy warden and was now running private security in Albany. The second to Sean O'Brien, retired state police with connections that ran deep through New York's law enforcement network. The third to Father Martinez, who'd ministered to death row inmates and knew how to counsel men facing their final choices. Each conversation was brief, coded, professional. Tank didn't explain everything, couldn't, over unsecured lines, but he conveyed enough. Something from the old days had resurfaced, something that required careful handling and trusted friends. By midnight, Tank had assembled the bones of a plan, not a solution. Vincent's pain ran too deep for simple fixes, but a framework for confrontation, a way to face the truth of what they'd both become in the 30 years since that night in D Block. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. at the old quarry on Route 9W, Tank would meet the ghost of Vincent Torino and discover whether broken men could find redemption, or if some wounds were too deep to heal. Either way, the running was about to end. Climax. Tank arrived at the quarry 15 minutes early, the November wind cutting through his jacket like a blade made of winter. The abandoned site stretched before him, a moonscape of broken stone and stagnant water where industry had died decades ago, leaving behind only scars in the earth. It felt appropriate somehow, this wounded place where wounded men would finally face the truth of what they'd done to each other. Jimmy Rodriguez's unmarked van sat hidden in the tree line 200 yards away, invisible to anyone approaching from the main road. Sean O'Brien had positioned himself on the ridge overlooking the quarry floor, his sniper's eye watching for any sign of backup Vincent might have brought. They'd argued against Tank going in alone, but this confrontation belonged to him. Some debts could only be paid in person. At exactly 2 p.m., Vincent Torino emerged from behind a pile of rusted machinery like a ghost materializing from industrial wreckage. 30 years had carved deep lines in his face, turned his hair silver gray, bent his shoulders under the weight of carrying too much pain for too long. But his eyes remained the same, hollow, haunted, searching for something that could never be found. They stood 50 feet apart, two old men in a wasteland, measuring each other across decades of accumulated damage. "You look older, Marcus." Vincent's voice carried across the empty space like wind through broken glass. "Good. I wanted to see what time and guilt had done to you. I know about Sophia." Tank didn't move closer, didn't raise his voice. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither man wanted to cross. "I know what really happened that night." Vincent's face crumpled for just a moment, grief breaking through the careful mask he'd worn for 30 years. Then he composed himself with visible effort, rebuilding walls that had taken decades to construct. "That changes nothing. You still took their money, still opened that door." "Yes, I did." Tank felt the admission tear something loose in his chest. "I took their money because I was weak and scared and drowning in debts I couldn't pay. I betrayed everything I was supposed to stand for, and I've lived with that shame every day since." "Good." Vincent's voice carried the satisfaction of a man who'd waited 30 years to hear those words. "Do you know what it's like, Marcus? To discover your daughter is dead because you were too busy being a monster to answer the phone when she needed you? To learn that she spent her last conscious moments asking for a father who cared more about blood money than bedtime stories?" The pain in Vincent's voice was a living thing, raw and desperate after 3 decades of careful burial. Tank could see the man Vincent had been before Sophia's death, the father who'd thought he could compartmentalize his life, keep the violence separate from love. "I know it's the worst thing that can happen to a human being," Tank said quietly. "I know it broke you in ways that can never be fixed. Then you understand why I'm here, why I need you to open one more door for me." "What door, Vincent? What do you really want?" Vincent reached into his jacket with movements that made Tank's entire body tense. But instead of a weapon, he withdrew a manila envelope, yellowed with age and worn smooth by decades of handling. 30 years ago, in that cell, Tyson didn't just tell me about Sophia's death. He told me about choices, about how every decision we make echoes forward, creating the world our children have to live in. Vincent's voice broke slightly. He made me understand that I'd already killed my daughter long before that drunk driver ran the red light. I'd killed her the first time I chose violence over being present, the first time I valued fear over love. Tank watched Vincent's hands shake as he held the envelope. "What's in there?" "Letters. One Sophia wrote to me that I never read because I was always traveling, always working, always convinced I had time to be a father later." Vincent's eyes filled with tears that had been dammed up for 3 decades. "Her teacher gave them to my ex-wife after the funeral. Maria saved them, thinking I might want them someday. But I ran instead. Became a ghost because facing the truth of what those letters contained would have destroyed me completely." The wind howled across the quarry, carrying the sound of 2 men breathing in the space between confession and absolution. "I can't read them, Marcus. 30 years, and I still can't bring myself to read my daughter's words. But I can't die with them unread either." Vincent extended the envelope with trembling hands. "That's the door I need you to open. Read them to me. Let me hear her voice one last time before this ends." Tank stared at the envelope, understanding finally dawning like sunrise after the longest night of his life. This wasn't about revenge or violence or settling old scores. This was about a father learning to say goodbye. Tank's hands trembled as he accepted the envelope, its weight impossibly heavy for something made of paper and ink. The manila surface was soft with decades of handling, worn smooth by a father's touch in moments when courage almost overcame fear. He could feel Vincent watching him with desperate intensity. 30 years of running finally brought to this moment of reckoning. "Daddy," Tank began, his voice cracking on the first word as he opened the first letter. "I drew you a picture today of us at the park. Mommy says you're working but you'll be home soon. I put it on the refrigerator so you can see it when you get back." Vincent's breath caught, a sound like something breaking inside his chest. His legs gave out, and he collapsed onto a chunk of broken concrete, hands covering his face as his daughter's voice reached across 3 decades of silence. Tank continued reading, letter after letter, watching Vincent fall apart with each innocent word. Sophia's handwriting evolved from careful kindergarten letters to flowing second-grade cursive, her thoughts growing more complex but her love remaining constant. She wrote about school plays Vincent had missed, soccer games where she'd searched the sidelines for a face that never appeared, bedtime stories she'd made up because Daddy wasn't there to read real ones. "I know you're busy saving people," Tank read from a letter dated 2 weeks before Sophia's death. "That's what Mommy says when I ask why you don't come home. She says you're a hero who protects families. I'm proud of you, Daddy. I just wish you could protect our family too. I miss you so much it makes my chest hurt." Vincent's sobs echoed across the empty quarry, raw and primal, the sound of a man finally bleeding out poison that had festered for 30 years. Tank kept reading through his own tears, understanding that this was sacred work, the last rites for a father who died the night his daughter did but kept walking anyway. When the final letter was finished, Tank carefully folded it back into the envelope and offered it to Vincent. But the broken man shook his head, unable to stop the tears that had been dammed up since 1994. "I can't," Vincent whispered. "I can't carry them anymore, but I can't destroy them either." Tank understood. Some burdens were too heavy to bear but too precious to abandon. He thought of Emma safely at school, unaware that her grandfather was helping another man say goodbye to everything he'd lost through his own choices. "There's something else," Tank said quietly. "Something you need to know about that night." Vincent looked up through tears, his face ravaged by grief, but somehow cleaner than Tank had ever seen it. "Mike didn't just tell you about Sophia to break you down. He told you because he understood. His own father was gone most of his childhood. He knew what it meant to be a kid waiting for someone who never came home." Tank's voice grew steady, certain. "He showed you mercy, Vincent, not cruelty. He gave you the truth because he thought you were strong enough to change. But I wasn't," Vincent said. "I ran instead, became exactly what he warned me against." "You're here now." Tank extended his hand toward the broken man. "You chose to face this instead of running forever. That means something. Sophia would understand that." Vincent stared at Tank's outstretched hand for a long moment, then slowly reached out and grasped it. The touch was electric, completing a circuit that had been broken for 3 decades. Two men who damaged each other, holding on while the wind carved new patterns in the stone around them. "I've been dead for 30 years, Vincent said quietly. "I don't know how to be alive again." "One choice at a time," Tank replied, thinking of Tyson's words, of second chances and the weight of doing what's right. "That's how any of us figure it out." They stood together in the ruins of the old quarry, surrounded by evidence of industry's abandoned dreams but holding something more valuable than stone or steel. Forgiveness, maybe. Understanding, certainly. The kind of peace that only came from finally facing the truth about yourself and discovering you could survive it. Vincent released Tank's hand and stepped back, his face still wet with tears but no longer hollow. "I don't know what happens now. Neither do I," Tank admitted. "But we figure it out together. No more ghosts, no more running." As they walked toward the road together, Tank felt the weight he'd carried since 1994 finally beginning to lift. Emma would be home from school soon, and he had stories to tell her, not about monsters or mistakes, but about broken things learning to heal and fathers learning, however late, to come home. The past was finished with them at last.